Hi, and welcome to the second short lecture from Chapter 7. So, in this short lecture, we're going to talk about the 1, 2, and 3-dimensional models of power. So, like any other model, the ones we're going to discuss here today are not necessarily accurate representations of power and how it works. The idea of a model is not to absolutely replicate reality. Rather, the idea behind a model is to break down an idea or a theory or a happening, and provide us with a framework so that we can better understand how it works. That's not to say that the model replicates all the nuances, and that's important to realize as we engage with these. So the first one we'll talk about today is the one-dimensional model of power. And this comes from Robert Dahl, who was a behavioral academic, right, who studied people's behavior. And what Dahl suggested, according to this one-dimensional model, was that, he put it like this. He says, A has power over B, right? One person has power over another, to the extent that he or she can get B, that other person, to do something that person would otherwise not do, right? So this is an example of what we call direct influence, right? Power as direct influence. So you come to my class. Let's say I'm A, and you're B. So you come to my class, and I exert my power by getting you to take an exam, because otherwise you wouldn't do it, right? So that's direct power, and that's very much an example of the one-dimensional model of power. Another example, a boss exercises power over an employee when that employee chooses not to go out when instructed the boss to deliver a report at 9 a.m. So, Dahl, in this equation, in this one-dimensional power model, figures the conflict has got to be part of it. Conflict is essential. So you don't really want to take the exam. You don't want to do the reading, but you do it anyway. So there is a degree of conflict in this scenario, right? Maybe a better example would be with my kids. So I want them to clean up their room before bath time, right? So I want you to clean your room. Oh, Dad, we don't want to do this. This sucks. I want to watch my tablet, or what, right? There's the conflict, right? So Dahl says, this conflict is always a part of things. Now, this also requires that these two people or groups bring two different perspectives or agendas to the issue. So I want my kids to clean up their room because I want them to have a clean room, right? So my preferred path of action is that I want them to clean it up. They don't want to clean it up. They want to keep watching tablets or playing PlayStation or whatever, right? So they have a different path of action. So according to Dahl, the group or individual with the most power is the one that resolves the issue in their favor. So if they do clean up their rooms, then that means I'm the one with the power. If they get away with not cleaning their rooms, it simply means they have the power. All right? Not a terribly complex idea, right? So when Dahl did his studies, he found that no particular group exercised a disproportionate amount of power over decision making. So what this means, if there is something surprising in this equation, this is it, right? Excuse me. So again, this is surprising because he finds that even though we assume that the parent is in power, a lot of times the parent doesn't get what they want, right? A lot of times the teacher doesn't get what he or she wants. And so for Dahl, he looks at this and says, well, okay, I mean, in theory, you have the position, right, and the title and everything, but people don't always do what you want them to do. And so for Dahl, he says, listen, if we really look at power, we have to understand that it's not vested in the people that we think have it a lot of times. All right, so Dahl's model is then later challenged by Bachrach and Barrett's, right? Who said, listen, Robert Dahl's one-dimensional model is overly simplistic, and what we really need is a two-dimensional model. And so according to the two-dimensional model that Bachrach and Barrett's came up with, they say not only is power exercised when someone persuades another person to engage in a behavior he or she would otherwise would have not, it's also exercised when someone prevents someone else from doing something he or she otherwise would have. So this isn't so for this two-dimensional model. They're saying, listen, it's not about just having someone do something that they weren't going to do on their own. You also exercise power when you stop someone from doing something that they were going to do. Now, again, going back to the kid thing, you could look at this and say, I tell my kids, don't you dare throw your clothes on the ground, right? And if I stop them from doing something that they were going to do, instead of putting their clothes in the hamper, throw them on the floor, right? If I stop them from doing that, that's an exercise of power too. So it's not just about getting people to do things, it's about getting people to not do things, right? So you can see how this gets a little bit more complicated. So again, if we put it in the same sort of equation, A has power over B, so one person has power over another, when that person prevents the other person from doing something they would normally do, right? Now, according to this model of power, conflict doesn't have to be present, right? This is so the two-dimensional model doesn't require fighting, right? It doesn't require people resisting, and that's an important consideration. Now, within the context of this, right, and a good example of conflict not being present is what we call the mobilization of bias, which is in and of itself an exercise of power. So the mobilization of bias occurs when some issues are organized out of public discussion. So you take some possibilities out of the equation, right? And then instead of those issues, you insert your own, right? You limit the scope of conversation, for example, to the things that you want to focus on. So you take some issues out, right? So this one gets more complicated. So with the mobilization of bias, power is exercised when when one person devotes his or her energies to creating or reinforcing social and political values and practices that limit the scope of political process to the consideration of only those issues which are comparatively innocuous to A. So what this means, let me give you a better, perhaps a more clear example, right? So there's a great historian by the name of Howard Zinn, and he wrote a famous book called A People's History of the United States. And in it, he points out a true scenario, right, one that exists in our culture today, that proves to be an example of the mobilization of bias. So he says 1% of the nation owns 1/3 of the wealth. So this is accurate. It's actually higher than that now, right? Since Zinn wrote this, but he says 1% of the nation owns 33% of the wealth. The rest of the wealth is distributed in such a way as to turn the 99% against one another. So as a result, small property owners are against people who are propertyless. Black people fight white people. Native-born Americans fight immigrants. Intellectuals and professionals against the uneducated, right? And he says, as a result, what happens is that these groups end up warring with each other, fighting with each other. And they do it violently, right? I mean, we know this. We know this from firsthand experience that we're all busy fighting over gender, about racial issues, about whether or not people are immigrants and so on, right? We're fighting over all these things, and we're fighting hard, right? And so what Zinn says is, listen, while we're doing this, it obscures our common position, the fact that we're all in this together, because all we're doing is sharing leftovers in a really wealthy country. We're ignoring the fact that 1% of the people control now almost half of the wealth. So for Zinn, this is the mobilization of bias. What happens is that so here's an example, right? You have a president who gets up and stokes people's concerns about football players kneeling at football games, right? In a protest for racial equity, right, and social freedoms, right, social rights. And for Zinn, what Zinn would say is, okay, he's doing this while simultaneously giving tax breaks to billionaires, right? Some of the biggest tax breaks in history to billionaires. And so what's happening is people get all pissed off, right? And everybody's debating whether or not, we should watch NFL games and look at these unpatriotic people kneeling and so on. And we're fighting with each other about this and not even realizing the fact that we're all in the same boat because we're getting screwed by the people who have all the wealth, right? So this is the mobilization of bias. That's how it works. It's a sleight of hand, right? I take the whole question of the inequities of wealth out of the equation, and instead you fight about something else because that's not even on the table to fight about when it's really the key social issue of our time, right? All right, so that was the two-dimensional model of power. Now in the three-dimensional model of power, this is conceived by a fellow by the name of Stephen Lukes, right? And he says both the one and two-dimensional models presume some form of conflict, right? In the one-dimensional model, there's overt conflict. Dad, I don't want to do this, right? That's the overt conflict. In the two-dimensional model, even though it pretends like conflict isn't present, he says it really deals with covert conflict that you can't see, competing interests that aren't even visible, right? But Luke says power can be exercised in situations where no form of conflict exists whatsoever. So according to this equation, he says A may exercise power over B by getting him to do what he does not want to do, right? So that's the direct mode of power. But he can also exercise power over him by influencing, shaping, or determining his very wants. He goes on to say, indeed, is it not the supreme exercise of power to get another or others to have the desires you want them to have? That is, to secure their compliance by controlling their thoughts and desires. So the idea here, of course, is that the ultimate form of power is getting people to believe in their heart of hearts all the things that you want them to believe so that you can maintain your power, right? And so some people, right, particularly people who study power from a cultural and Marxist perspective, look at things like advertising and they say, look, this constant barrage of the latest shiny thing, that's being advertised makes you want to go to work for someone else, earn a little bit of money, and be able to go buy that shiny thing, right? That we believe in shiny things, and that's where our interests lie. And what's happening, of course, is that the folks in charge, the people who are paying to have these ads made, right, these advertisements constructed, they're affecting you on a very basic level, where you think that getting ahead means having a BMW and a 4-bedroom house and so on, right? Now, of course, that's just applying this idea to questions of consumptionism, right, and consumer culture and so on. But it works in other ways as well, right? I mean, it's certainly in the Pope's best interest to have you be a devout Catholic, right? And that's probably a better example, simply because you internalize religious values, or many people do, and they follow the dogma or the teachings, the rules of the church, right? Now, it's important to recognize that in the case of the Catholic Church, for example, their rules weren't set by Jesus, right? Who presumably is the real authority in any Christian religion, but instead are set by the Pope. But people believe them as if they're gospel, quite literally, right? And that helps the church. Now, I should put a caveat in here. I'm not saying that religion is bad, but I'm merely pointing out how power works, and how if you get people believing that if they do the wrong thing, they'll go to hell, for example, and they believe it in their souls, that's going to work out pretty well if you're the Pope, right? So, from a managerial perspective, what we want to reach that three-dimensional model, right? We want our employees to believe so thoroughly in the power of I want my students to believe so thoroughly in the power of education and the wanting to get ahead and so on. That everything you do will support me maintaining my power. Right? I want you to do the homework. I want you to do the reading. I want you to have respect for your professor and so on. Right? I mean, that benefits me directly, particularly if you believe it in your heart of hearts. Because then I don't even have to, try and exercise power. I just get you to believe it. So, this goes back to people's sort of blind faith in things, right? So for example, my wife's grandfather, who just recently passed away. God bless him. I shouldn't be talking bad of the dead, but he just recently passed away. But he was a big Georgia fan, right? And so he used to fly these flags on his truck and all that kind of hokey stuff. And he loved Georgia football. And indeed, when he died, he had they buried him in a Georgia, he's wearing a Georgia state tie. Well, great, right? But he didn't go to Georgia. He never even went to college, right? So, why do people dress their kids like this and do things like this with their cars when they're not even affiliated with the organization? It makes no sense. But to him, he grew up and you were either a Tech guy or you were a Georgia guy, and that's all there was to it, right? And he was a Georgia guy. And so whatever power the folks at the USG and at Georgia exerted over the uneducated working people of Griffin, it worked, right? Because he believed in that school and in Georgia football to the point that when he died, he wore the tie. Again, for the three-dimensional model, conflict is not a necessary condition for the exercise of power, right? There was no conflict in my wife's grandfather wearing his tie. And consensus amongst different groups doesn't mean the power is not being exercised. Just because a bunch of people agree to be led according to certain rules doesn't mean that power isn't being exercised. And in the three-dimensional model, power operates at the level of what we call deep structure. And that's just a fancy word for saying that people believe it in their souls, right? It's ideology working on you. And this shapes people's very beliefs and their values. And of course, beliefs and values make up a lot of our identity and who we are. I'm not going to show this, partly because it looks like they block me, but it's also just a clip from the Matrix, which shows you this idea of how power operates at the level of deep structure. Okay, that's it for now. Thanks for checking out my video, and I'll see you for the next one.